So we're now kind of politically, we're thinking timeline-wise, we're now moving into the 70s. And so we're talking about a lot of different things and just hitting and missing and surveys and stuff. I want to talk about some politics in the United States. So while the Cultural Revolution is ending in China, there's this resurgence of conservative Christians making an impact on politics in the United States. In the early years of the 20th century, conservative evangelicals, or fundamentalists, and we'll talk about fundamentalists when we get to the doctrine part of the 20th century, had largely retreated from public life and politics. And fundamentalists had developed this kind of separatist mindset of, there's so much in American culture that is opposed to the message of Christianity. By the middle of the 20th century, however, some of these fundamentalists wanted to be more involved, particularly in shaping the political destiny of the United States. They felt the United States was going in the wrong direction. The precursor for this great re-engagement was the ministry of Billy Graham. Graham was born in 1918 near Charlotte, North Carolina. He graduated from Wheaton College in Illinois. Wheaton was a fundamentalist school. And after his graduation, he joined a parachurch organization known as Youth for Christ. It wasn't a church, but it was this group that was focused on evangelizing teenagers and young adults. But as he gets older, as he's getting into his 30s, he's starting to decide, maybe I want to do some other things and not just focus on evangelizing teenagers. And so he goes around to various places and tries to do these campaigns, and he's not very successful. I mean, there are people coming out, but it's not these huge gatherings. Until 1949, when he has a crusade in Los Angeles. In the 1940s, in the crusade in Los Angeles, which is held for about a week, Graham starts gaining conversions from celebrities. There's several celebrity sports figures that talk about having this conversion experience at a Billy Graham crusade. Additionally, his anti-communist message gained the attention of a newspaper owner named William Randolph Hearst, who owns several newspapers throughout the United States. And so here's this young man, right? He's in his 30s, fairly good-looking guy, very powerful presence, very good speaker. He's anti-communist. He's talking about America. He's talking about God. Hearst loves this. And so he tells his newspaper owner, his newspaper editors, he gives them two words that are two of the most famous words, in a sense, in American religious history. Puff Graham. Now what he means by Puff Graham is anything positive you can say about Billy Graham, you get it in that newspaper. I want him in that newspaper. I want him talked about. I want him publicly praised. And it works, right? Suddenly, Billy Graham is drawing in tens of thousands of people to crusades. He's, hundreds of people, thousands of people are talking about converting at a Billy Graham crusade. Ends up with a TV show. Eventually works his way into producing movies, all while evangelizing, missionizing as well. But he also then gains access to presidents, from Eisenhower even up through Obama, President Obama. They have all at some point met with Billy Graham. Many of them looked at Billy Graham as a spiritual advisor. And even when Mitt Romney was running in 2012, Romney being a Mormon, went and met with Billy Graham, who is in his 90s, right, his mid-90s. He's probably not going to live much longer. And so he gains access to presidents. But even though there's that, most fundamentalists, though, were suspicious of getting involved in politics through the 1940s, 50s, even into the 60s. But it's the 1970s that really encourages fundamentalists and evangelicals to get back involved in the political sphere of the United States. There's not much that you would have to dig through over the past decade, really past 15 years, to see people talking in newspapers or news outlets about the influence of evangelicals in American politics. But it is a relatively new influence from the 1970s. And so there's kind of a gap between the 19th century and the later 20th century. There's a variety of lawsuits that take place and a variety of Supreme Court decisions that take place in the 1970s that kind of push evangelicals back into the public sphere. Now, probably a lot of people would point to the 1973 decision of Roe v. Wade about an issue of abortion, as that's the moment that leads evangelicals back into politics, is the issue of abortion. Yes, many evangelicals from the late 1970s on have been very vocal about abortion, trying to limit it, but it's not really that big of an outcry until the 1980s. That most evangelicals looked at abortion as a Catholic issue. That's something Catholics are concerned about. Not that they supported abortions, but the idea was Catholics are political about that. That's not something we're that involved in. Instead, what appears to be the case is that there's an attempt by the IRS to revoke the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University, a fundamentalist university in South Carolina. That is the moment that forced evangelicals back into politics. Bob Jones was still is a fundamentalist university, but it was also very racially discriminatory in its policies. For a long time, it did not admit to the school African Americans and didn't have African Americans on staff. And so the IRS looks at this and says, okay, to be a nonprofit, you have to be a charitable institution. To discriminate against people because of the color of their skin doesn't make you a charitable institution. We're taking away your tax-exempt status. And so it's this moment that really starts getting evangelicals concerned, because here's the government kind of attacking, so to speak, their schools, even though today we would say it wasn't a good thing that Bob Jones was racist. But, in the 1970s, it's presented as the government intruding into Christian education. Eventually, this concern would form into an organization known as the Moral Majority. So the concern over the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones, eventually abortion getting wrapped into this, there's this concern for evangelicals to be publicly active, politically shaping the United States. Evangelicals throughout the late 80s into the late 70s into the 2000s were often mobilized in a variety of ways for support. Newsweek magazine called 1976 the year of the evangelical, because of the election or the candidacy of Georgia Governor and evangelical Jimmy Carter, who was elected through this upswell of evangelical hopes. But evangelicals soon became very dissatisfied because Carter appointed a lot of non-evangelicals in his administration. Right? And so there's kind of this moment of Carter's let us down. Right? He's one of us, but he's let us down. Right? And with him not repealing Roe v. Wade, that too also led to this kind of disappointment with Carter. And so when the election of 1980 came around, the moral majority switched from really kind of supporting Carter to supporting Ronald Reagan. Reagan was very successful gaining evangelical support. And it's kind of at this moment where evangelicals switched from being Democrats mostly to being Republicans. Even though we might often think evangelical and Republican in the same sense, it's not until the 80s that takes place. Well, Reagan ultimately didn't turn out much better for evangelicals than Carter did. There was a lot of promises, but things never fulfilled them. And after Reagan's 2 terms, evangelicals looked at the vice president, the first George Bush, and they didn't really feel very supportive of him because he was Episcopalian. He didn't seem to have strong socially conservative values. And so, there's this concern about who are we going to support. So into all of this, that's televangelist Pat Robertson. And he had been a strong supporter of Reagan, but with his concerns about Bush, decides he's going to run for the presidency. And in those early primaries, he has some success, which causes the Bush campaign to say, what are we going to do about Pat Robertson? Eventually, a lot of people swung towards Bush, the first George Bush, and that led to Robertson withdrawing from the race. But he has this group, this sizable group of supporters that were still a powerful political force, and so he forms the Christian Coalition. In 1989, the moral majority disbanded. Right? So it's in its existence for 10 years. And so the Christian Coalition is this national organization to kind of take over for the moral majority. The focus of the Christian Coalition was less on these national elections and more on grassroots initiatives. The way you change American society is you get elected to the school board, right? You get elected to county commission, and you start small, and that will start making its way through society. Now, certainly they didn't turn from international or from national politics. They were still very involved, but there was a lot more emphasis on doing things at the grassroots level. With the idea being that if you make that impact on those lower levels of government, it'll make its way up. But still very involved in national politics. Evangelicals were instrumental in the election of George W. Bush, the second George Bush, in both 2000 and 2004. But one of the things that we see with this kind of conservative evangelicalism, this connection between evangelicalism and the Republican Party, is that younger evangelicals have often been less accepting of this marriage between the Republican Party and Christianity, in religion and politics. And so there were a lot of younger evangelicals that swung to Barack Obama in the 2008 election. And so it remains to be seen how evangelicals are going to impact American politics in the future from this standpoint. Into this as well is the rise of Latino evangelicals. Because in the past century, there have been a lot of Latinos, both in Mexico, South America, as well as in the United States, who have been converting to Protestant forms of Christianity, especially Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism is one of the big winners, so to speak, of Latino presence in Protestantism. And so Latinos were very influential in the election of George W. Bush in 2004. But kind of swayed to the Democratic side in 2008 and 2012. And so it's a little, there isn't this kind of, for Latino evangelicals, there isn't this kind of easy equation between evangelical and Republican. Where for whites, there's still a sizable connection between evangelicals and the Republican Party. Yes, there are a lot of Democratic evangelicals, but there's still a lot of evangelicals would identify as Republican. That's not to say, however, that every evangelical supported the religious right, the Christian Coalition. We're backtracked now a bit, because around the same time as it is moving forward for the religious right and moral majority of the Christian Coalition, there's another side of evangelicalism that is politically different. Fundamentalism had stressed individual salvation. And so it had been less concerned about cultural change because the idea was you change individuals, right? You convert individuals, they will eventually change society. And so they weren't as active politically through the 30s, 40s, 50s. Now, many fundamentalists did speak out against communism. They were active on local level politics. But even some of the doctrines of fundamentalism that we'll talk about on Wednesday of next week discourage people actively being involved in social change. Now, when I'm using the difference here between conservative and liberal evangelicalism, I'm talking about their politics, not their theology. Often, conservatives and progressives or liberals held the same or similar theological views about the nature of the Bible, about the church, about things related to salvation. But they had different political views. One of the key figures in the development of this kind of progressive evangelicalism was a man named Carl Henry. He was a preacher, he was an academic, he was an editor. Born in 1913 on Long Island to largely irreligious parents, so he grows up not really particularly religious. At the age of 19, he becomes a reporter, later an editor for a newspaper, but the next year eventually converts to evangelicalism, to fundamentalism, essentially, and decides to go a different direction with his life. Enrolls in Wheaton College, like we talked about, but Wheaton is kind of undergoing this transition. It's getting accreditation, it's introducing sports teams, there's more of this let's get involved in the culture around us kind of mindset at Wheaton. There isn't that separatist mindset. And so the professors there at Wheaton encourage Henry to see the Christian mission as being about cultural transformation, not just individual salvation. Eventually will go on, get a PhD from Boston, will teach at Fuller Theological Seminary out in California. But in 1947, he releases a book called The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, in which he says, essentially, fundamentalism is not humanitarian. It did not address modern evils, things like aggressive warfare, racial hatred, right? He's writing this in the 40s. The exploitation of workers by management. There was no social passion among fundamentalists for Henry. Instead, fundamentalists only focused on the evils of alcohol, movies, dancing, without realizing that the gospel spoke to all areas of life. On the other hand, liberal Christianity didn't talk about the need for personal salvation, right? And so fundamentalists ignore the culture. The liberals ignore the individual and the individual's salvation. And so what needed to be present for Henry was a conservative theology, right living, and addressing social issues. Now, his text, right, the Uneasy Conscience, advocated these reforms, but it was very broad, right? These things need to change, but he doesn't really say how, right? And so it's just kind of this introduction here. Eventually, he will become editor of Christianity Today, as it starts in the 1950s. But we're still talking at a time period where political activism is looked down upon by a lot of fundamentalists. That's not something to be involved in. Instead, you should be involved in missionary work, individually converting people. And so the key to social transformation is this personal conversion. On Monday, we'll pick up with a couple other things related to Henry and some others in progressive evangelicalism as they try to deal with civil rights, Vietnam, some other issues like that in the politics at that time. So we'll pick that up on Monday.